currently working on a different video regarding a separate Alex Garland film, but I'm going to use that as a flimsy pretext to talk about Civil War now. Civil War is a movie about, you guessed it, a civil war. This one takes place in the near future in the North American region where the contiguous United States once stood. There's no real mention of American territories like Guam or Puerto Rico or the other two states not connected to the lower 48. And somehow Canada and Mexico are able to maintain their border integrity despite the power vacuum with one of the world's largest superpowers right next door. If you're paying attention, that's not necessarily realistic, and specifically, I'm looking at you, Canada. You keep exporting weird extremists to the US, and don't think I haven't noticed. I don't really want to get into whether or not it's a good or it's a bad movie. I know I enjoyed it, but that doesn't mean you have to. What is a nation but a shared illusion? Or, perhaps in a better way, a shared dream? What we can agree on and what we agree to for our own expediency are very separate things. I think that is what Civil War explores best. The ideologies of the various factions are not clearly stated, their goals and ambitions left entirely to interpretation. Everyone is fighting and dying for what they believe in, and we as the audience cannot question their commitment, even if we have no understanding of what it is they are willing to sacrifice their lives for. And I guess I just wanted to mention briefly the concept of patriotism and how it's never going to save us. Every American has their own idea of the United States and what it means, and that in turn shapes whether or not it means holding true to its traditions or whether it means working diligently to fulfill its promises. Both interpretations are always at odds with each other, despite a great deal of it being written down.
The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution.
And if I am to make one criticism, the fact that there doesn't seem to be a theocratic sect is wholly unrealistic, but it would be if this was actually a film trying to portray a war. Let me explain. At the risk of sounding pretentious, this movie is not even about war. The war itself is almost inconsequential to the main characters themselves. It does affect them, clearly. I mean, they're human after all, and witnessing countless war crimes and navigating an environment where safety isn't guaranteed is going to shape you in some way. However, as war journalists, they would have found their way into a war zone regardless of where it happened. If anything, the war occurring so close is just convenient. This movie seems to me at least more about purpose and what it means to lose it. I'm not going to dissect every aspect of the plot, but in fairness, there isn't much of a plot. This is a very visceral movie, from the sound design to the cinematography, and frankly, I don't really think it's going to translate well outside of a theater. It's just not interesting enough conceptually to work in any other format. I don't mean that as an insult. It's actually an achievement and actually quite brave in terms of what studios even allowed to be made and released widely to theaters. If you're going to see this, see it in theater. You're doing yourself a terrible disservice if you don't see this in the theater. The story is actually pretty simple. It follows a team of journalists on a road trip from New York to Washington, D.C. They're attempting to secure a final interview with the president because in the universe of the film, it's pretty obvious that one of the insurrectionist forces is about to take over D.C., and they'd like to get to him before that happens because, the thing that happens to failed leaders from countries that have collapsed. Anyway, purpose. Living in a crisis of legitimacy can, in some ways, be a freeing experience. In a world without order, one can choose how to create their own. I know that is an oversimplified take. It's, close to the point of being delusional. But, like I said earlier, this movie is not an attempt to create a realistic portrayal of life in a war zone, because, in my opinion, it isn't even an attempt to comment on war at all. The world created by the war in this movie is more or less a representation of Alex Garland's own freedom. And for those who don't know, Alex Garland has had a rather long and successful career in entertainment, and without doubt he can live how he chooses without the same pressures of someone like you or I who aren't as fortunate. The characters choosing their professions in a world where there are few, if any, material rewards shows their commitment to the craft, and this is meant to parallel the writer/director's own drive and commitment to craft. I believe it is a metaphor for Alex Garland's search for meaning in his own career, And the unfortunate side effect of a successful and long career in entertainment is quite often there's this inevitability of making what I call the love letter film. Anyone who lasts long enough in entertainment always ends up making a movie either about Hollywood or the filmmaking process itself. And sometimes there are some people who last long enough to make both types of movies. I believe Civil War to be the latter, which is the filmmaking love letter. To that end, this is why I believe the film was made entirely for the theatrical experience. The film is a representation of Alex Garland's internal struggle to create something that people can only experience in the movie theater itself, versus something that someone might just stumble upon while flipping through channels one late night, perhaps drunkenly. This isn't to say that this is the only thing the movie is about. There are more threads to pull at, but I'm just going to focus on the two photojournalists. One is seasoned and jaded. This is Lee, played by Kirsten Dunst. The other is naive but ambitious. This is Jesse, played by Kaylee Spaney. The other two characters on the road trip are Sammy, played by Stephen McKinley Henderson, and Joel, played by Wagner Moura. They're journalists as well, but of the writing variety. The movie is rather episodic. We get glimpses of what life on the road is like, and somewhat counterintuitively, the moments that they're not running headlong into danger to document the random battles are the moments that are the most precarious. In many ways, this parallels the conditions of filmmaking itself. When the action is happening, our journalists are there with a steady hand to capture moments for the benefit of an audience. They know how to exist in that environment. It is where they are most comfortable. It is in the time between battles that are the hardest for them to deal with. It is between one of these battles where the worst occurs. It's the moment you see from the trailer where Jesse Plemons says, "What kind of American are you?" and the journalists are trying to de-escalate. I don't care to describe the scene beat for beat, but the main four journalists find a way to escape, with Sammy unfortunately being shot in the process. Sammy eventually succumbs to his injuries, and this becomes a catalyst for Lee to begin to question whether what she is doing is even worth it. She even goes as far as to delete a picture she has taken of Sammy's corpse, symbolically erasing his existence before she scrubs his blood from the car seat in which he has died, removing any trace he was ever there. I can see how one might view Lee's deletion of Sammy's photo as a sign of respect. It isn't the most dignified way to be memorialized. However, in my youth I was very much into skateboarding, and like most kids who do this, you get together with your friends and you try to film tricks. You want to make a record of your accomplishments, however, that's not always easy. No one wants to fall, but it's an accepted risk, and if you fall bad enough, you don't want the physical sacrifice of slamming your body into concrete to have been wasted by it not being captured on film. So when Lee erases Sammy's photo, it read to me as a sign of disrespect. It's as if his sacrifice didn't even matter. There was already a tension between them throughout the movie because Lee could not view Sammy as anything but a burden. He was old, walked with a cane, and worked for an establishment media outlet, the New York Times. In the final few scenes of this movie, this comes back, though with Lee now becoming a burden because of a combination of personal doubt and PTSD. In her final moments, she sacrifices herself to save Jesse from a hell of gunfire, going back on a declaration she made earlier in the movie saying if Jesse was about to be gunned down that Lee would photograph Jesse's final moments rather than intervene. However, in Lee's final moments, the roles are reversed. Lee intervenes and Jesse documents her tragic end. With Lee's purpose no longer being that of a photojournalist, she has no life left to live, and she steps aside to make way for a new generation rather than remain a burden to them. Which actually is a lesson a lot of Americans could learn. I don't mean that I want the older generation to not live, but just knowing when to step aside and exit gracefully is something that Americans could stand to benefit from as a culture. And that's the movie. I did want to make some comment about how Jesse, the younger photographer, uses a film camera compared to Lee, who uses a digital camera. I imagine it was some statement about how the younger generations are always repurposing history and reinterpreting it for their generation. But, I'll leave that for someone else. Again, there's a lot in this movie to examine. The plot is threadbare and formulaic, but it's important to note that execution always beats complexity. Like and subscribe. Whatever. You don't have to.